Has being curious ever come at a cost for you? For many of us, our heresy began as nothing more than some questions for our Sunday school teacher, our minister, or priest.
Excuse me, but so how did Jesus die and come back to life?
How did Jesus die and then come back to life, you ask?
If God created the earth in 7 days, then when did he create the dinosaurs?
If God created the earth in 7 days, when did he create the dinosaurs, you ask?
Why is my friend going to hell?
Why is your friend going to hell? As we grew into teenagers, some of us were faced with having to condemn people to hell who seemed like perfectly fine citizens, good friends, people who loved humanity and for tangential reasons, owing more to biblical interpretation than the way they actually lived or acted, were doomed to burn in eternal hellfire. When our cognitive dissonance called us to question the theologies we were raised in, were our questions well received, friends? Were we told we were being good little girls and boys? No. Often you were threatened with the devils of lowest common denominator, or simply told to keep your mouths shut. How beautiful to hear the sound of the child explaining it's a mystery, and to feel the power to share that revelation to all of us this morning. I feel like I need not go on after that. But for many of us, for many of you, the questions you had hung there, little swords of Damocles hanging over your heads, closing in on you until somehow, some way you found your escape from the threat. You liberated yourself from a family, a church, or a culture that couldn't love your questions. Your questions, which turned out to be a huge part of your curiosity, your intelligence, the most interesting and beautiful part of you. Not a sickness to be cured, not a threat, well, maybe a threat, but an inescapable part of your selfhood to be celebrated. Somehow, you found yourself here, swimming in the deep waters of Unitarian Universalism. Now, as a cradle UU, my own cognitive dissonance was the opposite of the one I just described. Struggling with fear of death and wondering why bad things could happen to good people, I longed for some answers. Just tell me what happens after death. I would ask my mom, my dad, my minister, my religious educator, my Sunday school teachers. Sleepless in Chicago, I was desperate for answers. What do you think happens after death? My Unitarian Universalist mentors would reply. Grrr! This infuriating response kept me up most of the nights of my 10th year, and I wondered if another religion would provide the answers I craved. It wasn't simple answers I sought, though. It was actually solutions. Not a fantasy, not a pat on the head, but a solution for death, solution for war or the destructive nature of humans. And in many ways, my longing for solutions continues today. Even now, I struggle to accept the world that is, and I spend a great deal of time, perhaps too much time, in the world as it could be. What helped resolve my existential anxiety as a child was a relationship I had with a piano teacher who was Christian. And one day, when I was racked with guilt, with anxiety and fear, she gave me her personal, well-formed explanation of the afterlife, according to her. She took my curiosity seriously, and that was enough. Just to know that someone had an answer for themselves didn't pressure me in any way. Instead, I found solace in her solace. After a year of insomnia and fear, it was truly the solace I sought, and I have slept relatively well ever since. And it is understandable to have deep and existential longing for solutions. Sometimes the longing, the confusion is so painful, we tell ourselves we have already come to the solutions. I mean, we already know what should happen. Until last week, I never realized how many random Americans were capable of solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I never realized how many of us have just been sitting on the global political solution all these years, just waiting for the right platform. If only your brother, your coworker, your neighbor could have an audience with the leaders of the Palestinian state and Netanyahu, well then, he would have succeeded where so many others, ambassadors and presidents, peace scholars and litigators have failed. In the early aftermath of the Hamas attacks on Israelis, we all struggled to make sense of what was happening. We feared saying the wrong thing. We felt culpable, horrified. Some of us related as Jews or people who are deeply connected to the Jewish community, painfully aware of the rise of anti-Semitism around the world. Others of us feared for the safety of Palestinians and saw the attacks as the outcome of years of violence, forced occupation, and dehumanization. Most of us are praying in our pain and powerlessness that someone, somewhere can produce a solution, and quickly. But the solutions or answers we might invent here, well, they come from a position of privilege. As citizens of a nation who has found ways to outsource its own violence across the world. We are often too quick to come to conclusions about how others should exist. It may be a moment instead, not for answers, but for deeper questions now, and the humility that those questions can lead to. In the children's book we're reading right now at home, The Phantom Tollbooth by Norton Juster, a journey into the magical, absurdist world of how knowledge is learned, formed, and taught, we come to this land where letters have flavors and numbers are mined in caves. Here, where the main character, Milo, becomes stuck for a chapter on the island of conclusions. This island is a bleak and rocky shore where people become frozen by fear of the unknown, gathered in a still, quiet crowd looking out at a vast shoreline, the sea of knowledge, but with no particular desire to find out how to leave. And so they remain there trapped on the island of conclusions. Norton Juster published his classic novel in 1961. The same year, the Unitarians merged with the Universalists at a conference in Boston, which led me to ask one of the three questions we sing. Where do we come from? Our spiritual ancestors, you see, have always asked dangerous questions of the powers that be. If you look back into the historical origin of Unitarianism and Universalism too, although I'm focusing more on Unitarianism today, sorry Herschel, this faith without certainty sprouted from the seeds of questions in 1553 when Michael Servetus, a Spanish Catholic, published a book repeating assertions he had made in his earlier writings that the doctrines of the Trinity and infant baptism made no sense. He was asking dangerous questions about biblical proof of the Trinity and questions about whether God was truly three, but was maybe just one. Well, the order for his arrest went out, and one Sunday morning, soon thereafter, he was spotted at a Genevan church. He was arrested, tried for heresy, and executed with a copy of his published book, The Restitution, his essay of dangerous questions, strapped to his body. A couple of centuries later, I'm kind of going quickly, there's a lot of other stuff that happened, but a couple of centuries later in Britain, Joseph Priestley was the leader of the group that in his time came to be called the Unitarians, writing and preaching questions about, again, the legitimacy of the Trinity. See, they weren't finding it in the scripture until eventually he was driven to England in 1794 by continuing threats to his life. And so he came over to the United States of America, where he settled in Pennsylvania. 2 years later, he helped found in Philadelphia the first American society calling itself Unitarian. The legacy then continues into the 19th century. Liberal religionists, Channing, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Theodore Parker, people who asked questions of a theological nature, disrupting previous puritanical scriptural assumptions, expanding towards the mystical with a religious and social emphasis on human dignity and equity. And it is not lost on me that Joseph Priestley, the man credited with bringing Unitarianism to America, is also known as the inventor and discoverer of what? Oxygen. As a scientist and as a religious disruptor, his curiosity led to oxygen, while it became the air we breathe, as keepers of this tradition of deep and dangerous questions. Which brings us to the present day, and that second question: what are we? What a time to be a Unitarian Universalist in this modern era, when as a society we face sweeping new legislation on book banning. I mean, not good legislation. Not legislation that leads us to read more. The American Library Association, which started the Banned Book Week 40 years ago, has reported that book banning is on the rise. In 2022, they documented the highest number of attempts to ban books since they began keeping track, and then double the number of the attempted bans in 2021. And in just the first 8 months of 2023, there have already been more attempts to ban books than there were in all of 2022. And we all know that in Cobb County, Georgia, earlier this year, the district fired elementary school teacher Katie Rinderly for reading the picture book My Shadow is Purple by Scott Stewart, after which some parents complained. They referenced a board policy prohibiting teaching on controversial issues. I mean, that's the policy. It's so vague, there was no way she could possibly know which books would be prohibited. And if we were a people who practiced curiosity like it was our religion, we might ask why. Why, when loving parents are now wanting to affirm their child's gender, we are seeing an increase in book bans? We might ask why. Why, when parents are wanting their children to learn more about racism and historical narratives of slavery and civil rights, why are we seeing an increase in book bans? Bringing curiosity deep into this issue, my colleague, Reverend Jennifer Nordstrom, notices we are at a moment when loving parents who want to affirm their children's gender, when we are watching these book bans increase in the name of protecting innocence rather than protecting trans kids. But banning books will not erase trans kids. It will only make their lives more difficult. Banning books about sexuality will not erase queer kids. It will only make their lives more difficult. And banning books about race and ethnicity will not erase BIPOC kids. It will only make their lives more difficult. And so the question becomes, whose innocence is being protected and at whose expense? So this is where we are in 2023. A time of state-sponsored violence, global chaos, simplified, polarized politics, and the repression of ideas. So what about that third question in the song? What is it? Where are we going? Book bans are unjust, unfair. They contribute to our ongoing oppression. On the other hand, if I am staying curious, then a ban on a book is really more like an arrow telling me which way to go. And as they age, we know children become more rebellious by nature. I believe we can count on many of them to follow the thing the politicians don't want them to know. And if we are people of questions, comfortable with questions, we can encourage this in the children. And if we are to maintain a life stance of being curious, not judgmental, well, then we are sure to seek out the stories the powers that be don't want us to hear. We will be secure also in our questioning, secure in the reality of all we don't know. This stance requires humility. It requires ego strength. You see, when you have nothing to prove, like Ted Lasso in that clip, then instead of offering your take, your wisdom, your sage advice, you can be secure instead in the power of your questions. See, there was a time when I, as a child, hoped for easy answers. Now, I long to become skilled in the art of curiosity. I want to be a person who asks the right questions, the ones that draw you into deeper awareness, into epiphany. We can ask questions of each other, of the world, that lead us all to deeper empathy. Questions that draw out each other's stories. Questions that draw out each other's power. When we are faced with each other, we can take the Ted Lasso philosophy. I'm not really sure if it's truly Walt Whitman who said that. So I'll say the Ted Lasso philosophy, and we can stay curious, not judgmental. Just seeing each other and peering into one another's lives to find out more. This is the healing path, the path of connection. And in conversation, I believe curiosity, true curiosity, is a rare trait. It is rare to encounter authentic curiosity about each other's dreams, each other's heartbreaks, hopes, and setbacks. And when we are faced with a repressive force, be it a bully or a government, an institution or a mansplainer, we can remember it is our religious birthright as Unitarian Universalists to ask dangerous questions. We remember how our spiritual ancestors were brutally punished for asking dangerous questions, and we know that dangerous questions are a deep and formative core, at the core of our faith tradition. We are known by our dangerous questions, my friends. We ask questions like it is our religion, because it is. So in the face of overwhelming violence and complexity, stay curious. Offer questions that heal, questions that save, questions that make good trouble. We may not know exactly where we are going, but our curiosity can be our superpower. So rest in knowing that you don't need to know it all today. Just let your faith lead you to the questions that will liberate the most people. Dangerous and powerful questions that, if framed well, can set us all free.